Hello everyone, I hope you find yourself having a great day. I've got a quick tutorial for Cinema 4D regarding depth of field and how to use it on your camera. Now depth of field is how a camera, its lens, and the aperture relate to what objects in the scene are in focus. So let's get started. In this scene we've got a scene that's rendered obviously without a camera. There's no camera in our project manager. So with this scene, all the elements are in focus. We have the foreground, the primary elements of the scene, and the background, where everything is in focus. Now, camera, if you've got it close to an object and focused on that object, that it's in focus, and the elements in the background and foreground are out of focus or blurry to some degree. So let's get started. We're going to add a camera to our scene, and with that, we're going to add a few attributes to it. While we've got our camera selected, let's make sure that under our Details tab, we'll need to enable the Depth of Field Map Front Blur. And that's going to establish an area close to the camera where focus begins to an area at a distance where focus ends. So, how do we manipulate this? We can manipulate it with these incremental controls here, or we can go into above view of our camera, and we'll zoom in on this scene. And this first line, this first dot, is a control point where you can establish that begin depth of field front blur area. And then you've got this area here, which will establish the back blur area to some degree. So let's give an example where we want this front sphere in our scene, this one here, in focus. And what we're going to do is we're going to move this focal plane out at a distance. You can see that it includes the majority of the scene. And we're going to take this rear blur element right here, or the beginning plane, and we're going to put that right on that front sphere. Alright, so now we've got that here, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and give a test render. But before we do that, we need to add a few more elements to our render settings. So let's jump into our render settings. And here you'll see that we are saving it to the desktop as a PNG file. We need to do something else. We need to, under multipass, first click the checkbox to enable that. And while it's highlighted, you have an option here called multipass. We need to include depth, which is at the very bottom. You'll need to scroll all the way down, and it's at the very bottom. So enable that. Now that we've got multipass enabled, we have the depth field attribute applied to that. We need to tell it to save. Okay, so we've got our primary image that we're going to render, saving to the desktop with the name of test PNG. And if it's not twirled out, on yours, twirl out multipass image. And we need to tell it to save also. So we're going to save that to the desktop, and we're going to call that depth for the depth map. And we're going to save it as a PNG also. Now what we're outputting here is the current frame. We have 400 keyframes in our timeline, and we're going to output the current frame that the camera is currently on in the timeline. So make sure that you enable current frame, and then the dimensions of whatever you'd like to render your scene at. Alright, so if we go ahead and give this a test render, let's let that run. I have ambient occlusion and global illumination applied to the scene so we can get a better quality render for this example. So it's rendering, it's applying the global illumination right now, and because we're in our camera and we're looking through the camera, the attributes that we've applied to the depth of field and any lens parameters we've established are going to be applied to the scene and the depth of field related to this scene. So in this you'll see that the primary image that we're rendering is unaffected, and that's a good thing because it's also generating a depth of field map that we can use in programs like After Effects. So let's minimize this and take a look on our desktop. We've got our primary image selected, right? And then you'll see that we've also got our depth of field selected. Now this is black for a couple of reasons. If we go back into our scene and we jump back into the scene, you'll notice that we rendered from the viewpoint of the scene, not the viewpoint of the camera. And remember, those attributes that we've applied, the depth of field front blur, the multipass, and the saving of a depth of field map are only going to be applied to a camera. So you need to render your scene from the viewpoint of a camera. Now, although our camera is selected, we're not looking at the scene through the camera. So remember, when we looked on the desktop, we had the scene rendered. That was from the viewpoint of the scene, not the camera. And we also have our depth of field map rendered, but from the viewpoint of the scene, not the camera. So back into Cinema 4D, at this point, if we jump into our camera while it's selected, and at this time we hit render, we're going to overwrite that previous scene that we rendered. Now we're going to have some different attributes applied. We're going to have our front depth of field map applied. We're going to get a multi-pass render in regards to that, and we're going to also have a usable depth of field map because we're looking at the scene from the viewpoint of a camera with a lens and a certain aperture that's been applied to it. So once this is rendered, we'll jump back out to the desktop and have a look at the files that were created there. So right now it's about to finish up the primary image that we're using in our scene, and as soon as it's done, it'll immediately generate a depth of field map that we can use. Okay, so that's finished. Let's jump back to our desktop. You'll see we've got the same primary image rendered, but from the viewpoint of the camera. And if we look at the depth of field map, it's now generated a nice depth of field map, which is something we can use to manipulate further in After Effects. Now, what does this depth of field map mean? Well, items that are in focus are brightly lit, and the gradient aspect or point of view of things, they're white. Now, things that are more of an intermediate focus or a lighter dark color, it's almost a gray. And things that are completely out of focus are black. So we've got this sphere in focus, and as we progress backwards in the scene, things get darker and darker, and then finally are completely out of focus. So let's go back in here for one more example. Let's jump up to our top view, and let's say that we would like this front sphere to be out of focus, but maybe our primary area of interest is right here where we've got these four spheres lined up. All we'll do is we'll move that depth of field front blur here closer to those, right, in line with this. And if we hit render now, let's let that overwrite that, and just bear with me, we'll render the scene one more time, then we'll move on into After Effects with it. After Effects, you should give consideration. You may not want to play around so much as the begin range and the end range. It would be better that you have the entire range in focus. Then you can use a fuselage plugin in After Effects that will allow you to actually move through that depth of field range and even apply even more tweaks to that to get more customization and a more believable depth of field. You can even keyframe that depth of field, which will give the lens focus pull effect. So let's drop back down to our desktop, and now we've got our primary scene, we've got our depth of field map, and you'll see now that our focal plane has moved. Where you see this white line, it's moved forward to some degree. Now you can get even trickier with this in regards to going into your camera setup and enable the depth of field rear blur. And when I do that, you'll see another plane of focus added here. So what do we have? We have a foreground, maximum foreground focal plane. We have our area of maximum focus, and then we have our area of primary focus. So for example, let's get on to the same plane of focus, except we're going to reduce this, and we're going to say we don't want that front sphere in focus at all. And we want to even stop that focal range before our last sphere. So if we render this guy out, you're going to see we have a completely different effect. Now we've got a small area that we're going to have in focus. And the area this side of that towards the camera is going to be out of focus. And our distance focal plane areas on the back side of that are going to be in focus. So we've got a very tiny area in the center that the camera is going to focus on. So as it finishes up this primary scene render, it'll begin to render that depth pass. Alrighty, so it's getting close. And you'll see nothing changes in these primary scene renders except for that depth of field pass. So let's jump back to the desktop and take a look at our scene. Again, our scene as we'd expect, and our depth of field now. where only the focal plane is selected on this sphere and the background continues to be out of focus at the area that we've chosen our scene limit to be within. So we're going to generate one more, and this one we're going to use for After Effects, where we've got the entire range in focus. So we can disable this map back blur. We're going to pull this maximum range out to here, and we're going to pull our minimal range into here, so that every item in our scene is in focus. And we'll jump back into perspective view, and at this point we're going to hit render, and we're going to keep this one. This is the one we're going to work with in After Effects. Remember that everything in the maximum foreground is in focus all the way through the scene to the back. Everything will be in focus, but we will have our depth information that we can later apply in After Effects to shift that focal range as a camera would, as it were to change its focus from a foreground object to a background object, which adds a very neat effect. Like I said, you can keyframe this information, whether you do it in After Effects or in Cinema 4D, so that it looks like the camera's handheld and it's attempting to gain focus on an object. Okay, so we're finished here. Let's minimize. We'll look at these one more time. Our primary image and our depth image. So areas in white are close, areas in dark are distant. So we're going to bring that into After Effects now by importing these files. And we've got the two. We've got the test, so we need to find those. We've got our depth, and then we've got our test. So we'll control click and bring those guys in. Now let's drag them into our composition. And you'll see that we've got our depth, and then if we hide that, we've got our test object. I'm going to put my test object on top just for ease of use. Now, how do we use this? In regards to using it with the Fruchtloft Lens Care plugin, and what it does is offer you a very, very neat way of applying a depth of field manipulation to a scene. So I'll do a search for that, and here it is. We're going to drag that onto our primary image here. And at this point, it's got some options, and we're going to need to tell it what image do we want to use as our depth map. And we want to use that depth image that we created. So our depth layer, we're going to tell it depth as the one that we'd rendered. Now, here's the neat part. We can adjust the focal point of that scene. We can adjust the radius of that scene. See how if I manipulate these sliders, it would appear that I'm pulling a focus, if you would, in a camera. So you can see that we're in this scenario, we're giving focus to this front sphere. If I zoom in on that, let's give it the full strength of the render. You see that this front sphere is in focus, and we can change that focal plane, moving that area of focus further forward or further back by controlling these sliders. And now you'll see that I can change the degree of focus. I can make it extremely blurry. All right, and I can also change where that field of focus goes, either further close or further back. So let me reduce that. See here, we've reduced that focal radius. Let me knock that back a little bit to maybe 5. Okay, makes it a little easier on the CPU to handle that. And we can see how we're moving that focal range further to the back, where we've got more in focus. You can change that focal point or change that radius so that you're more in focus or less in focus. Now our spheres in the back are in focus, where the foreground spheres are out of focus. And all you've got to do is manipulate that so that you can slide that focal point either closer to you or further from you. And see, now our front is in focus, and if we need to blur that background, we can bump that radius up a little bit. So now these in the background are out of focus, and the ones in the foreground are more in focus. And just depending on where you get that, you get your accuracy a little more in tune with your scene. And what's neat about this is you can keyframe this. You might start off by adding a keyframe to that radius. And let's expand that out and look at our effects. And so we've got a keyframe set here, and if we move forward a few frames, then at this point we might manipulate that so that it's set to 0, And now we've got a keyframe here and here. And as we move through this scene, you can see how the distant objects are out of focus. And as we move forward in our timeline, the front objects become in focus. All right, so I hope that helped somebody who had an interest in learning depth of field, or at least getting the basic concept of depth of field in Cinema 4D, and then taking it over to After Effects. There's other programs that you can use to manipulate that, but for this example, we used After Effects. So I hope this was helpful to you guys. If you liked it, give me a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more tutorials in the near future, please subscribe. Alrighty, talk to you later. Bye-bye.